What if I told you that behind the cold stone walls of medieval nunneries, there were secrets far more shocking than prayers and silence? The world imagines nuns as pious, pure, and devoted, but the reality of the Middle Ages was a tangled story of forbidden desire, scandalous trials, and whispered confessions that the Church tried desperately to bury. Within the cloister, some women sought holiness, others sought escape, and some found themselves drawn into webs of lust, corruption, and power. From whispered confessions of lust to political power struggles within convent walls, to stories of runaway sisters and accusations of witchcraft, this is history at its most forbidden. This is not the sanitized tale of devotion we've all been told. This is the unfiltered history of medieval nuns exposed. The rise of female monasticism in medieval Europe. Female monasticism began not as an afterthought, but as a central piece of Christianity's growing influence in the early Middle Ages. As the Church spread across Europe, it encouraged women to withdraw from the temptations of the flesh and dedicate themselves to God. For noble families, sending daughters into convents was both an act of devotion and a practical solution: fewer dowries to pay, and a chance for the family to secure influence in the Church. What began as small, scattered communities soon grew into sprawling convents that shaped the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual life of Europe. At their foundation, nunneries were built on the rule of Saint Benedict and similar monastic codes. These rules emphasized silence, prayer, labor, and obedience. But within these walls, life was not always so uniform. Wealthy convents often resembled miniature courts, with educated women copying manuscripts, studying theology, and even composing music. Poorer nunneries, by contrast, struggled to maintain order and discipline. The diversity of these convents set the stage for both holiness and scandal. The rise of nunneries was also deeply political. Kings and nobles donated land and wealth to convents, expecting prayers for their souls in return. Abbesses, female heads of convents, could wield as much power as bishops, making them both admired and resented. In many places, convents became centers of influence, where decisions made behind cloister walls echoed far beyond the church gates. Yet, with such prominence came scrutiny. Already by the 9th century, complaints arose about lax discipline, rumors of misbehavior, and accusations of luxury. Bishops began writing warnings against nuns who dressed too finely, ate too well, or mingled too freely with men. These whispers, whether true or exaggerated, would fuel centuries of suspicion about what really went on behind convent doors. The ideal was chastity, poverty, and obedience. But the reality was far more complicated. These contradictions between sacred vows and human desire would fuel the long, scandalous history of medieval nuns. Rules of silence, poverty, and chastity. To understand the scandal, one must first understand the rules that define nuns' lives. Silence was the foundation of cloistered life. Speaking outside of prayer or necessity was seen as a door to temptation, gossip, and sin. Meals were taken in silence, communication often replaced with gestures. This was meant to create discipline, but it also created isolation, and in isolation, forbidden thoughts often took root. Poverty was another vow, though its application varied widely. Some convents were so wealthy that their nuns dined on meat and fine wine, while others survived on little more than bread and vegetables. The vow of poverty was more symbolic than absolute. Still, nuns were not allowed personal possessions. Everything they owned, even their bedding or books, belonged to the convent. This stripping away of worldly identity was intended to free the soul for God, but it also created resentment. Chastity was, of course, the central vow. A nun was considered the bride of Christ, her body no longer her own, but dedicated wholly to the divine. To break this vow was considered not just a sin, but a form of spiritual adultery. Yet, the stricter the rule, the more tantalizing its violation. Throughout the Middle Ages, church records are filled with trials, scandals, and accusations of broken chastity, some proven, others invented as political weapons. But rules were never enough on their own. Each convent had to enforce them. Abbesses wielded authority to discipline their sisters, sometimes gently, sometimes with shocking severity. Public penance, whipping, fasting, or isolation were used as punishments for broken vows. The very existence of these punishments reveals something crucial. Transgressions were not rare. What emerges from these rules is a paradox. On paper, the convent was a fortress of purity. In practice, the tension between strict vows and human weakness ensured that scandal was never far away. Cloister walls, separation from the world. The cloister wall was both a physical and symbolic barrier. Once a woman entered, she was cut off from the world outside, from family, society, and especially from men. This separation was designed to protect purity, but it also created a breeding ground for secrecy. What happened inside was known only to those within, and outsiders could only speculate. For many young women, especially those sent to convents against their will, the cloister wall felt like a prison. Letters from medieval nuns reveal longing, resentment, and even rebellion. Some begged their families to rescue them. Others described the suffocating monotony of prayer, labor, and silence. The walls that promised safety could also become cages of desire. At the same time, convents were never completely cut off. Priests entered to hear confessions. Bishops arrived for inspections. Male workers, builders, and servants often passed through. Each encounter created opportunities, sometimes innocent, sometimes scandalous. The wall was never as solid as it appeared. The secrecy of cloister life fascinated medieval society. Tales spread of hidden feasts, drunken celebrations, and even orgies within convent walls. Many of these stories were exaggerated or invented. But their persistence reveals a cultural obsession. People could not stop imagining what holy women might do when no one was watching. Thus, the cloister wall symbolized both purity and suspicion. It shielded the nuns from the world, but it also shielded the world from the truth about the nuns. And where truth is hidden, scandal thrives. It's the spiritual bride of Christ, a nun's sacred vows. The metaphor of marriage to Christ was not symbolic alone. In elaborate ceremonies, a new nun received a ring just as a bride would, signifying her union with the divine. Her veil marked her as Christ's spouse, and her convent as the home of this mystical marriage. This image was meant to elevate the nun's life, to give sacred meaning to her sacrifice. Yet the very language of marriage introduced a dangerous tension. If Christ was the husband, what happened when flesh and blood men entered the picture? Many medieval sermons warned of priests or monks seducing nuns, describing such sins as betrayals of a sacred union. The warnings themselves suggest how often such liaisons occurred. For the nuns themselves, the metaphor of spiritual marriage could be both empowering and troubling. Some described ecstatic visions of Christ embracing them, kissing them, even lying with them in mystical union. To male theologians, this was spiritual allegory. To many readers then and now, it reads as erotic. The line between spiritual devotion and sexual fantasy was dangerously thin. The Church celebrated this metaphor publicly, but feared its implications privately. Ecstatic visions, if too sensual, could lead to accusations of heresy. Nuns who spoke too boldly about their mystical experiences were often silenced, their writings censored or destroyed. Thus, the very foundation of the nun's identity, her marriage to Christ, carried within it the seeds of scandal. A role designed to suppress desire often inflamed it instead, both in the imaginations of the nuns and in the suspicions of the world. Education and literacy in the convent. Despite the scandals, convents were also centers of learning. In an age when few women could read, many nuns became highly literate, preserving manuscripts, copying texts, and even composing their own. Some convents were renowned for their libraries, rivaling the collections of monasteries and universities. This literacy gave nuns both freedom and danger. With access to texts, they encountered ideas beyond the cloister. They read theology, medicine, and philosophy, but also romances, poetry, and tales of love. Church authorities worried that such readings could inflame the passions and corrupt purity. Education also gave nuns a voice. Letters survive in which they express their frustrations, their ambitions, and even their desires. Some challenged bishops, others defended their convents against slander, and a few openly criticized the hypocrisy of male clergy. Their words reveal sharp intelligence and fierce independence, qualities that could be both admired and feared. But with knowledge came temptation. Erotic literature sometimes circulated within convent walls, fueling rumors of lust and scandal. Authorities attempted to censor such works, but manuscripts were difficult to control. The same skills that made nuns preservers of sacred knowledge also made them custodians of forbidden stories. Thus, the convent was not just a place of prayer, but a place of ideas. Knowledge gave women power, and power in the medieval church was always dangerous. Forbidden thoughts, lust and temptation behind walls. The church taught that the convent was a fortress against sin, but human desire does not vanish with stone walls. In fact, isolation often intensified it. The strict routine of prayer, fasting, and silence sometimes backfired, making the forbidden all the more alluring. Medieval theologians themselves admitted that the more one thought of resisting lust, the more it haunted the mind. For nuns, the vow of chastity was both their highest virtue and their greatest torment. Personal writings reveal moments of startling honesty. Some nuns confessed to priests that, during prayer, their minds wandered to forbidden desires. Others described dreams filled with temptation, which they attributed to demonic attack. But not all such confessions were couched in shame and private letters. A few women hinted at enjoying the fantasies their vows were meant to suppress. These private glimpses suggest that temptation was a daily battle, not an occasional stumble. The church responded with constant reminders. Abbesses read sermons warning that lustful thoughts were the devil's whispers. Spiritual manuals urged nuns to beat their breasts, to pray longer, or to seek penance if their minds strayed. Some were even told to sleep on hard beds or wear coarse hair shirts as protection against sinful dreams. But repression could not erase imagination. In many cases, it only sharpened it. The paradox is clear. The convent was designed to eliminate temptation. But instead, it often became a place where temptation thrived in silence. The quiet corridors, the endless hours of contemplation, and the lack of worldly distractions gave the mind freedom to wander, and it wandered often into forbidden territory. Confessions of the flesh, priests, and nuns entangled. If the cloister wall was meant to keep men out, the priest was the one figure who could always step inside. His role was indispensable, hearing confessions, saying Mass, and serving as spiritual guide. But this access also created scandalous opportunities. From the earliest centuries, church councils issued warnings about priests becoming too familiar with nuns, a polite phrase that masked very real affairs. Records of ecclesiastical trials tell the story in blunt detail. Some priests were accused of fathering children with nuns, forcing bishops to investigate and cover up the shame. Others smuggled love letters through the grill of the confessional. One case in 14th century France describes a priest who disguised himself to sneak into a convent at night, a practice not isolated to one daring man, but echoed in multiple regions. For the nuns, these relationships were double-edged. Some genuinely fell in love, others were coerced. And still others may have seen the priest as their only chance at intimacy in an otherwise locked world. The line between seduction and abuse was often blurred, especially when confessions intended as sacred became tools of manipulation. The church tried to stamp out such scandals with ever stricter rules. Some dioceses ordered that priests could not hear confessions alone with a nun, or that convent chapels must have grills to prevent physical contact. But these measures often came too late. The damage was already done, and the rumors already spreading. In these tales, the priest meant to be a bridge between the nun and God became instead the source of temptation, scandal, and sometimes ruin. The irony was not lost on medieval observers, who whispered that the holiest places often hid the darkest sins. The secret lovers of the cloister, while priests were the most obvious culprits, they were not the only men to cross convent thresholds. Servants, gardeners, and even passing pilgrims sometimes found ways to form forbidden bonds with nuns. Some relationships were fleeting, others endured for years. Though secrecy was vital, love has a way of leaving traces, pregnancies, letters, or sudden scandals that drew the church's wrath. One of the most infamous cases comes from 15th century Spain, where several nuns were discovered to have maintained secret lovers for years. Some met them in hidden gardens, others snuck out at night disguised in cloaks. The trial records describe a web of secrecy that involved not only the women, but also lay servants who acted as go-betweens. The scandal rocked the local community, confirming long-held suspicions that convent walls were not impenetrable. For the women themselves, these lovers were more than carnal partners. They represented freedom, humanity, and often genuine affection in a life otherwise stripped of choice. Many of these nuns had been placed in convents by families without consent. Secret love affairs, dangerous as they were, gave them back a sense of agency in a world that had stolen it. But discovery was ruinous. Some women were expelled in disgrace, others forced to do lifelong penance. A few were imprisoned in convent dungeons, locked away for years. Yet despite the risks, the stories keep appearing in records, century after century, proving that human desire was stronger than the Church's fear. These hidden romances, sometimes tragic, sometimes tender, reveal the humanity of women trapped in cloisters. They were not merely saints or sinners, they were human beings navigating the sharp edge of forbidden love. Nunneries as escapes from marriage. Not all women entered convents for piety. For many, the nunnery was an escape, sometimes from unwanted marriages, sometimes from abusive families, sometimes from the dangers of childbirth. In medieval society, a woman's life was often tightly controlled. Marriage meant obedience to a husband, endless childbearing, and little personal freedom. By contrast, the cloister, though strict, offered education, autonomy, and community. For noble women, this choice was particularly appealing. Some were placed in convents to avoid costly dowries, but others actively sought the life. Letters survive from aristocratic women who begged to enter nunneries to avoid political marriages. For them, chastity was not a burden but a shield against being used as pawns in dynastic games. But motives could be mixed. Some women entered convents under duress, others willingly, and still others treated it as a temporary refuge until circumstances outside changed. Convents sometimes became sanctuaries for women fleeing abusive husbands or demanding in-laws. In these cases, the cloister was less a cage than a refuge, albeit one filled with its own dangers. This tension shaped the life of the convent. Some nuns were there by choice, embracing their vows with sincerity. Others were unwilling captives, constantly testing the boundaries of obedience. This mix of devotion and resentment made for volatile communities, where scandals were almost inevitable. Thus, while the world imagined nunneries as pure sanctuaries, they were often deeply human places, places where women sought protection from the cruelties of medieval society, only to find new struggles within cloister walls. Erotic literature circulating in convents. It may surprise many to learn that erotic literature was not unknown in convents. Manuscripts moved from hand to hand across Europe, and even cloistered women had access to them. While much of the reading material was devotional, there are surviving records of romances, poems, and even body tales being found in nunneries. The Church worried deeply about this. In multiple councils, bishops warned against corrupting texts entering convent walls. The fear was not merely of improper reading, but of the imagination such stories stirred. A tale of knights and maidens, or worse, explicit love poetry, could fuel the forbidden thoughts that nuns were supposed to repress. Yet literature was not so icily controlled. Nuns who served as scribes sometimes copied secular works alongside sacred texts. Others composed their own writings, blurring the line between devotion and desire. One German convent was famously reprimanded when a bishop discovered that the sisters were performing songs with melodies borrowed from love ballads, sacred lyrics unable to mask the sensual undertones. In many ways, literature was the silent lover of the cloister, a source of passion, imagination, and rebellion that could not be whipped or silenced. Erotic tales gave nuns a private space of fantasy, safe from the immediate punishment that physical scandal would bring. But once discovered, the outrage was just as fierce. The presence of erotic literature inside convent walls reveals an uncomfortable truth. Even in spaces meant to suppress the flesh, desire found ways to write itself into existence. The affair of Sister Agnes, a medieval trial in the late Middle Ages. A sensational trial unfolded that exposed the vulnerability of convent walls and the hypocrisy of those sworn to chastity. Sister Agnes, a young nun from a well-known French nunnery, was accused of maintaining an affair with a local nobleman. Unlike many such cases that were hushed up, this one became a public spectacle because her family was powerful, her lover influential, and her scandal impossible to bury. The records reveal the trial as both deeply personal and profoundly political. The accusations included not only secret meetings and letters, but also charges of pregnancy, a matter the church could neither ignore nor excuse. Witnesses included fellow nuns, servants, and townspeople who claimed to have seen Agnes slipping through hidden passages. The trial drew crowds, with rumors spreading like wildfire that the convent was nothing more than a brothel cloaked in holy vows. Sister Agnes's defense is equally telling. She argued that her vows had been forced upon her as a child, and that her heart had never truly belonged to Christ, but to the man she loved. This raw defiance shocked her contemporaries. By voicing it publicly, she revealed the quiet truth of many women forced into convents against their will. The church punished her severely, stripping her of her veil and sentencing her to confinement. Yet ironically, the scandal weakened the reputation of the convent itself more than it harmed Agnes's lover. For critics of the church, her story became proof of clerical corruption and institutional hypocrisy. The affair of Sister Agnes shows how one woman's scandal could ripple far beyond her cloister, shaking the very foundations of faith and exposing the fragile veneer of purity that nunneries claim to uphold. Papal inquiries into nunneries. When local bishops failed to keep scandals under wraps, sometimes the matter reached the highest levels, even the papacy. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Vatican received disturbing reports about nunneries rife with corruption. Some inquiries were sparked by political rivals seeking to embarrass a convent, while others came from genuine concern that holy houses had become dens of sin. Papal legates were dispatched to inspect nunneries across Europe. Their reports often sound like something out of scandalous gossip: nuns wearing luxurious silks instead of rough habits, eating feasts instead of fasting, and in some cases, entertaining male visitors. One 14th-century inquiry into Italian convents revealed that some abbesses were secretly running their communities as family estates, funneling wealth to relatives and ignoring vows of poverty. These investigations revealed a striking tension. On the one hand, the church wanted to uphold its image of sacred purity. On the other, it knew that too much exposure of corruption could undermine its moral authority. The solution was often carefully staged reforms rather than true transparency. Some abbesses were removed, others quietly warned, but rarely were the scandals broadcast to the wider world. Yet the fact that papal inquiries were necessary at all suggests just how widespread suspicion had become. These nunneries, supposedly devoted to prayer and penance, had become lightning rods for criticism of the entire clerical system. Papal inquiries into nunneries tell us less about isolated incidents and more about systemic issues. When vows collided with wealth, power, and human desire, even the strongest cloister walls could not hold. Brothels in disguise, nunneries accused of corruption. Few accusations were more damning than the claim that a convent was little more than a brothel. This scandal surfaced repeatedly in medieval chronicles, often fueled by enemies of particular convents, or as propaganda during political conflicts. While not every accusation was true, enough evidence survives to show that some nunneries did indeed fall into shocking corruption. In Germany, a notorious case described a convent where nuns were said to host banquets for wealthy men, slipping away with them into private chambers. In England, during periods of lax enforcement, there were rumors of cloisters where travelers could purchase the company of a sister. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories damaged the reputation of all convents. As they spread quickly through satire, poetry, and gossip, the social impact was immense. For the devout, these tales were horrifying proof that Satan himself had invaded holy ground. For critics of the church, they became weapons, used to argue that monastic life was inherently corrupt. During the Reformation, such accusations were revived with vigor, as Protestant reformers claimed nunneries were nothing but sexual prisons or disguised brothels. Importantly, many of these charges had political motives. Wealthy nunneries sat on prime lands, and accusing them of vice was a convenient way for nobles or rival clergy to seize control of their property. But even if only a fraction of the rumors were true, they exposed the fragile boundary between sacred and profane in cloistered life. The phrase brothels in disguise thus became both an accusation and a symbol, a way to articulate the deep mistrust of institutions that demanded purity while often hiding corruption. The pregnant nun. Stories of shame and cover-ups. Perhaps the most explosive scandal of all was when a nun was discovered to be pregnant. Unlike whispered rumors of secret lovers or illicit letters, a pregnancy was undeniable. The swelling belly was physical evidence that vows had been broken, and it forced the church into a desperate scramble to cover the shame. Records of such cases are scattered across Europe. Some convents hid the women away, sending them to rural houses where they gave birth in secrecy. Others forced them into public penance, stripping them of their veils and declaring them fallen women. In the worst cases, the newborns were abandoned or killed to erase the evidence. Behind these grim stories lay deeper human tragedies. Many of the pregnancies were not products of romance, but of coercion, abuse, or even rape, often by priests or confessors who exploited their power. The shame fell entirely on the nun, while the men involved frequently escaped punishment. Yet not all tales end in despair. In some communities, sisters banded together to protect the woman, raising the child in secret or passing it off as an orphan. These acts of solidarity reveal the quiet resistance that could exist within convent walls, where loyalty to one another sometimes outweighed loyalty to the institution. The pregnant nun scandal reminds us that cloisters were not immune to the realities of human vulnerability. The image of pure brides of Christ shattered instantly when confronted with the undeniable proof of broken vows. Witchcraft and lustful nuns in popular imagination as medieval Europe slid into periods of fear and superstition, nunneries found themselves tangled in accusations of witchcraft. The idea of lustful nuns practicing sorcery became a staple of popular imagination. Pamphlets and sermons described sisters who summoned demons, flew through the night, or held orgiastic sabbaths within cloister walls. While much of this was exaggerated fantasy, it reflected real anxieties. Women who defied their vows were not only seen as sinful, but as dangerous, their sexuality portrayed as a force allied with the devil. Stories circulated of nuns possessed by demons, writhing in ecstatic fits that blurred the line between spiritual rapture and sexual frenzy. Some convents became notorious for such tales. In France, one abbess was accused of using love potions to seduce priests. In Germany, a convent was said to harbor women who transformed into animals at night. While these accusations often lacked evidence, they reveal how quickly suspicion could turn into legend. For the common people, the idea of witches and nunneries was both terrifying and titillating. It fed the dual fascination with sacred purity and forbidden desire, mixing religion with sexuality in a potent brew of fear and fantasy. The association of lustful nuns with witchcraft shows how scandal was not only a matter of fact, but of imagination. Even when little truth existed, the cultural myth of the demonic nun lingered, shaping how generations viewed convent life. Noble women forced into the cloister. Throughout medieval Europe, noble families often treated nunneries not as religious sanctuaries, but as convenient repositories for their daughters. The cloister was a solution for many problems, to many heirs dividing estates, dowries that would cripple the family's wealth, or rebellious daughters who did not fit the mold of marriage alliances. Many noble women did not choose the convent life. It was thrust upon them, often while they were still children. This practice created tensions within the cloister, as unwilling nuns lived alongside women who had truly embraced a spiritual vocation. The clash of motivations, one rooted in family strategy, the other in faith, produced silent resentments that lingered for decades. Imagine a 14-year-old daughter of a count or duke, stripped of fine gowns, forced into plain habits, jewels exchanged for rosary beads. While her brothers inherited lands and power, she was condemned to a life of silence and submission. Records reveal numerous cases of young women who protested, some screaming at the altar during their forced vows, others attempting to flee before the ceremony was complete. Yet, to the eyes of medieval society, this was not abuse, but prudence. The convent was cheaper than a dowry and provided families with the moral sheen of piety. This reality turned nunneries into a patchwork of women with vastly different outlooks. Some noble nuns used their background to command respect within the cloister, holding privileges denied to poorer sisters. Others remained bitter prisoners, cultivating hostility that sometimes erupted in scandal or outright rebellion. Letters from Abbesses reveal frustrations over managing unwilling brides of Christ, who stirred unrest. The cloister, designed for prayer and unity, often became a simmering cauldron of suppressed anger. The forced cloistering of noble women also highlights the commodification of women's lives in medieval Europe. Their destinies were not determined by personal faith, but by the economic strategies of powerful families. Some accepted this fate with resignation, turning toward genuine devotion. Others resisted their frustration, finding expression in gossip, manipulation, or secret affairs that would later scandalize the church. In the end, these unwilling nuns embodied a paradox, symbols of holiness to outsiders. Yet within their convent walls, they carried resentment that sometimes erupted into the very scandals history remembers most. Abbesses as queens, women of influence, while many nuns were powerless, abbesses stood at the opposite extreme. At the height of the medieval church, abbesses wielded authority comparable to princes. They controlled vast estates, commanded servants, and answered only to bishops or, in some cases, directly to the pope. The role of abbess elevated women into positions of influence unimaginable in secular life, allowing them to act as political players in an otherwise male-dominated world. Certain abbeys, such as Fontevraud in France, placed women firmly in command over both monks and nuns, a radical inversion of gender hierarchies. Abbesses there issued orders to men, oversaw financial dealings, and sometimes engaged in diplomacy. Their wealth and status made them figures to be courted by kings, nobles, and merchants. They received gifts, lands, and protection, yet their power was precarious, constantly threatened by accusations of corruption or moral laxity. Abbesses also played critical roles in cultural preservation. They oversaw scriptoria, commissioned manuscripts, and acted as patrons of art and architecture. Some cultivated reputations as mystics, blending spiritual authority with political power. But with influence came enemies. Chronicles often recorded hostile portrayals of abbesses, depicting them as greedy, lascivious, or power-hungry, a reflection not only of possible abuses, but also of male resentment at their unusual authority. To their communities, abbesses could be both protectors and tyrants. Some enriched their convents, improving the lives of their sisters. Others imposed harsh discipline or hoarded wealth. The cloister's fate often rose and fell with the character of its abbess, whose leadership was both a burden and a weapon. The abbess was a queen without a crown, a paradox of female power in a world that otherwise denied women autonomy. The stories of abbesses remind us that nunneries were not merely passive retreats. They were vibrant centers of influence, shaped by women who, despite vows of humility, learned to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Nuns, as landowners and political players beyond abbesses, entire nunneries became economic forces in medieval society. Convents held lands, collected rents, and engaged in lawsuits to defend their property. In some cases, they managed vast estates with peasants working under their authority, effectively transforming nuns into landlords. This financial independence gave certain communities remarkable leverage in local politics, often to the frustration of secular rulers. The economic might of nunneries made them both respected and resented. They competed with monasteries in towns for resources, and disputes frequently escalated into drawn-out legal battles. Nuns employed lawyers, wrote petitions, and even appeared at royal courts to defend their interests. Far from being silent brides of Christ, they were assertive participants in the economic game of medieval Europe. Yet their wealth sometimes clashed with the vows of poverty. Chronicles describe nunneries adorned with tapestries, gold chalices, and expensive liturgical garments, luxuries that undermined their spiritual image. Critics accused them of hypocrisy, arguing that their wealth revealed a worldly corruption beneath the guise of piety. These accusations often fed into broader scandals, portraying convents as dens of excess and vice. Still, the economic role of nunneries cannot be dismissed. They provided stability in times of famine, offered sanctuary during wars, and employed local workers. Their lands shaped the fortunes of villages and towns, making them integral to the social fabric of medieval life. Political rulers recognized this, alternately courting and confronting them depending on the needs of the moment. In a world where most women had little legal or financial standing, the political agency of nuns as landowners stands as one of the most striking contradictions of the medieval church. Their very existence blurred the lines between sacred devotion and worldly power. Forbidden wealth. The scandal of luxurious convents, one of the greatest scandals surrounding medieval nunneries, was their taste for luxury. Though vows demanded simplicity, many convents became centers of opulence. Gifts from noble patrons filled chapels with gold, silver, and precious relics. Nuns dined on fine food, wore silken habits, and surrounded themselves with comforts, rivaling those of noble courts. For critics, such excess betrayed their sacred vows, turning the cloister into a parody of religious life. Satirical writings from the era mocked nuns who feasted while peasants starved. Poems circulated describing brides of Christ drinking imported wines, reclining on feathered cushions, and employing servants to perform menial tasks. Such depictions may have been exaggerated, but they reveal the strong resentment stirred by convent wealth. Too many luxurious nunneries symbolize the corruption of the church, feeding broader calls for reform. The contrast between poverty-stricken convents and wealthy ones was stark. While some communities barely survived on alms, others thrived as exclusive retreats for the daughters of nobles. These aristocratic nunneries became semi-palatial residences, where status mattered as much as prayer. For elite nuns, the cloister offered a life free from the dangers of childbirth and the burdens of marriage, yet still full of privilege. Wealth also fueled internal conflicts. Poorer sisters often resented the luxuries enjoyed by their noble companions. Chroniclers record disputes over clothing, food, and the use of convent resources. The cloister, supposedly a realm of harmony, was fractured by class divisions echoing those of the outside world. Ultimately, the scandal of luxurious convents reinforced suspicions that nunneries were less about God and more about comfort. This perception would haunt them in later centuries, making them easy targets during the waves of reform and suppression that swept through Europe. It's the battle between monks and nuns for power, finally. We arrive at one of the most enduring tensions in medieval religious life, the struggle between male and female orders for authority. Though united under the church, monks and nuns frequently clashed over resources, hierarchy, and influence. Many nunneries were originally founded under the protection of male monasteries, leaving them dependent on monks for spiritual guidance, confessions, and the administration of sacraments. But as nunneries grew in wealth and status, they resisted male oversight, sparking bitter disputes. Monks often accused nuns of overstepping their bounds, while nuns complained of exploitation and control. Abbesses in particular sought to assert independence, claiming spiritual authority equal to that of abbots. These battles sometimes reached papal ears, resulting in decrees that alternately strengthened or weakened female autonomy. The cloister was thus not just a battlefield of the flesh, but a battlefield of power. The struggle also revealed deep anxieties about gender roles. To allow women too much authority was seen as dangerous, even heretical. Yet the sheer persistence of nunneries, their wealth, and their influence forced men to acknowledge their importance. Some compromises were reached. Nuns accepted limited oversight while continuing to exercise considerable independence. But the conflict never truly disappeared.
At its core,
It reflected the paradox of medieval Christianity, an institution that elevated women as brides of Christ, yet constantly sought to limit their earthly power.
nuns pushed against these limits, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly.
Carving out spaces of influence that defied their supposed subservience. The battles between monks and nuns remind us that the cloister was not a passive refuge, but an arena of negotiation, conflict, and resilience. It was here, in the tension between devotion and authority, that much of the drama of medieval religious life unfolded. It's the ecstasies of Saint Teresa and other holy women. Few images capture the mingling of sanctity and sensuality as vividly as the accounts of mystical ecstasy. Saint Teresa of Avila, though technically from the later period, became the most famous example. Her visions were so intense that artists centuries later portrayed her in postures almost indistinguishable from erotic rapture. She spoke of an angel piercing her heart with a burning spear, leaving her all on fire with great love of God. For her, this was an expression of divine intimacy. But to outsiders, it resembled the language of physical desire cloaked in spiritual terms. Teresa was far from unique. Medieval hagiographies are filled with women who collapsed into trances, moaned in ecstasy, or writhed on the ground during mystical encounters. Chroniclers describe these events with awe, but also unease. For the line between holy rapture and bodily indulgence seemed dangerously thin. Were these women touched by God, or overtaken by their own flesh? The ambiguity gave fuel to critics who accused them of hysteria, delusion, or worse, of disguising sensual pleasure as divine communion. For the women themselves, ecstasy was often both torment and joy. They fasted to the point of collapse, whipped themselves to summon visions, and embraced sleepless nights in pursuit of a deeper union with Christ. Their bodies became theaters of divine drama, but also lightning rods for suspicion. Priests and confessors debated endlessly over whether these experiences came from heaven or from the devil. Leaving the mystics caught in a perpetual trial of faith, what makes these accounts so striking is their language. To modern ears, the metaphors of burning, piercing, ravishment, and sweet surrender sound startlingly physical. It was not lost on medieval observers either, who sometimes whispered that holy women were guilty of indulging secret lusts under the guise of mystical prayer. Thus, the ecstasies of nuns reveal one of the deepest paradoxes of cloistered life. Their pursuit of spiritual purity often brought them to the very brink of scandal, as visions of heaven became inseparable from the imagery of passion. Mystical marriage. Visions of Christ as lover. Among the most fascinating aspects of medieval spirituality was the concept of mystical marriage, the belief that a nun could become the literal bride of Christ. This was no metaphorical arrangement in their eyes. Some women received visions of Christ placing rings upon their fingers, sealing a union as intimate as any earthly marriage. The imagery was profound, but also charged with implications that blurred devotion with desire. In certain convents, ceremonies were held where young nuns donned bridal gowns, wore crowns, and received symbolic rings, pledging themselves to Christ as their eternal spouse. These rituals were solemn, yet they mirrored the pageantry of worldly weddings so closely that they reinforced the idea of Christ not as distant redeemer, but as an intimate, even physical partner. Some women claimed to converse with Christ as if with a lover, describing nights spent in his embrace, filled with warmth, comfort, and sometimes overwhelming passion. Theological authorities tried to frame these visions within the safe language of allegory. Christ was the husband of the church, they argued, and the nun merely embodied this sacred union. But the nun's own writings often slipped into a language of personal intimacy that alarmed confessors. Descriptions of tender caresses, secret encounters, and heart-piercing love carried echoes of human romance that could not be ignored. For some mystics, the mystical marriage was not just symbolic, it was experienced in the body. Trances left them trembling, flushed, or exhausted, as though their union had physical consequences. Such accounts walked the razor's edge of acceptability. Admirers praised them as saints touched by divine grace. Skeptics whispered that these visions masked forbidden yearnings. Mystical marriage then became one of the most powerful yet dangerous expressions of cloistered devotion, an attempt to transform loneliness into intimacy, but one that risked being seen as a spiritualized version of human desire. Self-flagellation, pain, and erotic spirituality. Pain was central to medieval spirituality, and within convents it often became a form of obsession. Nuns whipped themselves until their backs bled, wore hair shirts that scraped their skin raw, or bound themselves in chains as constant reminders of Christ's suffering. These acts were meant as demonstrations of piety and penance, but they carried undertones that contemporaries sometimes recognized as disturbingly sensual. Chroniclers noted that some women seemed almost intoxicated by suffering. They described visions where Christ appeared wounded and bleeding, inviting them to share in his agony. In these moments, pain became a gateway to union, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Yet the intensity of their practices raised uncomfortable questions. Could pain, meant as denial, become a source of forbidden pleasure? In certain accounts, nuns wrote of their bodies trembling with both torment and rapture as the whip fell. Others described the warmth of blood as cleansing, the ache of the flesh as strangely sweet. These writings walk a fine line, one foot in devotion, the other in experiences we might recognize today as bordering on eroticized pain. The Church itself struggled with how to interpret them, sometimes canonizing such women as saints, other times denouncing them as deluded or possessed. Self-flagellation also became communal. During certain rituals, entire convents would gather to whip themselves, their cries filling the chapel in a chorus of pain. Observers outside the cloister could scarcely resist drawing lurid conclusions about what truly transpired within. The spectacle fed rumors that nuns' ascetic practices were not as innocent as they claimed. In the end, these rituals highlight the dangerous ambiguity of medieval devotion. Pain could sanctify, but it could also excite. The body denied pleasure, sometimes founded in the very act of denial itself. The blurred line between sainthood and scandal, few figures illustrate the paradox of medieval nuns more clearly than those caught between sainthood and scandal. Some were revered for their visions, miracles, and ascetic lives, yet simultaneously accused of deceit, heresy, or lust. Their reputations swung wildly between holy adoration and damning suspicion, depending on who told their stories. Take the example of mystics whose trances captivated communities. To devoted followers, these women were living proof of God's presence, their words and gestures imbued with divine meaning. But skeptics saw only theatrics manipulation designed to attract attention or gain influence. Inquisitors, ever watchful for heresy, sometimes interpreted the same visions that inspired awe as evidence of demonic possession. The ambiguity was compounded by the language of these women themselves. Their writings often blurred categories, speaking of burning love, ravishment, and longing that could sound holy to the devout but scandalous to critics. Whether they were saints touched by divine fire or deceivers lost in delusion was often decided not by their actions, but by the politics of the moment. This instability reveals much about medieval society's discomfort with female authority. A woman whose visions challenged the church risked being branded heretical, while one who submitted her experiences to male confessors might be praised as a saint. The same behaviors could elevate or destroy, depending entirely on context. Thus, the blurred line between sainthood and scandal tells us less about the nuns themselves than about the precarious position they occupied. Their bodies, their words, and their reputations were battlegrounds where faith, power, and suspicion collided. Accusations of demonic possession, when mystical experiences strayed too far from accepted norms, accusations of demonic possession quickly followed. Medieval Europe was steeped in the belief that the devil sought to corrupt women and the cloister, filled with isolated and emotionally intense individuals, became a natural stage for such fears. Nuns who screamed during visions, convulsed on the ground, or spoke in strange voices were sometimes hailed as holy but just as often suspected of harboring demons. Priests performed exorcisms in convent chapels, binding and blessing women who were thought to be tormented by spirits. The spectacle of possession turned the cloister into a theater of fear, drawing both fascination and horror from those outside its walls. Some cases carried scandalous undertones. If a nun confessed to being tormented by visions of lust, her possession was interpreted as evidence that the devil had corrupted her flesh. In certain infamous episodes, entire convents were swept by waves of supposed possession, with dozens of nuns writhing, shrieking, or claiming to be attacked by unseen forces. These events blurred the line between hysteria, repression, and genuine belief. The accusations could also be deeply political. Rival factions within the church sometimes used claims of possession to discredit women whose influence they disliked. A charismatic abbess might be praised as a holy visionary by supporters, while enemies denounced her as a witch, consorting with demons. In both cases, the spectacle of possession reduced women's voices to battlegrounds of interpretation. Ultimately, the theme of demonic possession reflects the deep anxieties medieval society harbored about women's bodies, desires, and authority. The cloister, meant to be a fortress of purity, instead became a place where the devil's supposed influence was most feared and most dramatically displayed. Medical knowledge in nunneries within the cloistered walls, where silence often reigned and prayer marked the hours, knowledge of the body was both a necessity and a guarded treasure. Many convents became centers of healing. Their nuns trained in rudimentary medicine passed down from older sisters or manuals of natural philosophy. These women were not mere caretakers of the soul. They were also healers of the flesh. They learned to diagnose fevers, set broken bones, and even attempt primitive surgeries, often drawing from ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, smuggled or adapted into the monastic libraries. For the church, this was a delicate balance. Allowing women such intimate knowledge of the body was both empowering and threatening. The nun's role as healer carried a deep contradiction. On the one hand, her vocation was meant to distance her from earthly concerns. On the other, illness made her profoundly responsible for the physical welfare of her sisters. This intimate familiarity with bodily processes brought nuns into dangerous territory, for the line between caring for health and meddling with forbidden knowledge was thin. Some clerics accused them of practicing medicine without authority, or worse, of dabbling in witchcraft. Yet in many communities, nuns were trusted far more than local male physicians, who were often unaffordable and less accessible. In some rare but telling records, bishops condemned convent infirmaries for their unnatural curiosity. These accusations reveal a deeper fear that women, through their medical practice, were coming to understand anatomy, fertility, and reproduction in ways the male hierarchy could not control. The body, for the Church, was a site of both danger and revelation, and within the convent it became a contested ground. Nuns who sought to heal walked a perilous path, celebrated by their peers but carefully watched by their superiors. Herbs, healing, and the secrets of women's bodies beyond the crude instruments and copied medical texts. Nuns became masters of herbs. The convent gardens were more than places of beauty. They were pharmacies in miniature. Lavender soothed the restless sage was given to women with heavy bleeding, and rue was whispered to have secret use, sometimes even as a contraceptive. Knowledge of such plants was passed in hushed tones, rarely written down, for the fear of scandal or heresy lingered. This botanical wisdom gave nuns power. Ailing villagers often came to the convent gates, desperate for remedies that male physicians dismissed or overpriced. In some regions, the convent became the unofficial hospital for the poor, and the nuns its silent doctors. But this power was double-edged. If a woman's bleeding stopped too suddenly, or a pregnancy was mysteriously lost after a nun's intervention, rumors spread of sorcery. Some inquisitors came to believe that convent gardens hid not only remedies but poisons, love potions, and abortifacients. The secrets of women's bodies that nuns guarded were often inseparable from their own experiences. Unlike celibate monks, they bled monthly, suffered childbirth before entering the cloister, or cared for sisters in labor. Their hands-on knowledge of reproduction created a hidden layer of expertise the Church could never fully regulate. In this silence, convents became places where women understood themselves and each other in ways that defied the rigid theology imposed from outside. Midwives in disguise, nuns in childbirth. Officially, nuns were supposed to remain detached from the earthly drama of childbirth. In practice, however, many convents became sanctuaries for women in labor. Nobles sometimes sent their wives to convent infirmaries, where sisters were trusted for their discretion. The irony was not lost on critics. Women sworn to chastity often ended up ushering new life into the world. Records suggest that some nuns, especially those who entered the cloister after marriage, brought with them knowledge of midwifery. They understood how to turn a breech baby, how to soothe a mother's pain with herbs, and how to whisper prayers that calmed the terrified. For some, assisting in childbirth was framed as charity, a way to ease suffering in the name of Christ. Yet this work pushed against boundaries, for it placed nuns in direct confrontation with the mysteries of sex and reproduction, the very forces they had renounced. Scandals inevitably followed. If a noble's child was malformed, or a mother died in labor, suspicion often fell upon the convent midwives. Whispers of curses or devilry could ruin reputations. And yet their services were sought again and again, proof that in an age of fragile life and high mortality, the skills of women, even cloistered women, were indispensable. The cloister, supposedly sealed off from worldly concerns, became a secret participant in one of the most intimate dramas of human existence: sexual repression and psychological strain. Behind the walls of the convent, the vow of chastity demanded more than physical abstinence, sought to extinguish desire itself. For some nuns, the battle was bearable, sublimated into prayer and devotion. For others, repression bred visions, hallucinations, and nervous afflictions. Medieval medicine recognized conditions like hysteria, often tied to sexual abstinence. Though physicians had no words for the deep psychological toll of denied intimacy, some accounts describe sisters falling into fits, speaking in tongues, or experiencing uncontrollable trembling during prayer. To their confessors, these episodes could be signs of demonic attack or divine ecstasy. Modern readers might see them as symptoms of strain, women's bodies rebelling against relentless control. Without any outlet for affection, desire often twisted inward, manifesting as obsessive attachment to a confessor or unhealthy rivalries between sisters. The strain of lifelong repression haunted convent chronicles. The Church praised those who conquered the flesh, but the hidden reality was more complex. For every saintly example of purity, there were untold stories of breakdowns, despair, or even open rebellion. The convent was not just a house of prayer, it was a pressure chamber, where discipline and denial clashed violently with human need. The punishments for breaking vows: if temptation was a constant companion, punishment was its shadow. Nuns who broke their vows of chastity faced severe consequences, ranging from humiliating penances to outright expulsion. Some were locked in solitary cells, forced to fast for weeks, or paraded before the community in rags as symbols of shame. In extreme cases, wayward nuns were even imprisoned by secular authorities, treated as criminals rather than spiritual failures. But not all punishments were equal. A nun caught in secret correspondence with a lover might be confined to her cell for years, while a nun who gave birth could be banished entirely. The most infamous cases where abbesses themselves were accused of corruption often attracted papal investigations, turning private lapses into public scandal. Punishment, then, was as much about protecting the Church's image as it was about correcting the sinner. Yet these harsh measures reveal the true stakes of convent life. To falter in one's vows was not simply a personal failing. It threatened the very legitimacy of the cloister. And so, behind the stone walls, the body was policed with relentless vigilance. Every slip, every rumor, carried the risk of ruin, not just for the woman herself, but for the institution that claimed to speak for God, the German nun who challenged the Pope. Germany's convents were often hotbeds of intellectual energy, but also of scandal. In the 14th century, one German nun whose name flickers in chronicles only as a daughter of noble blood took the audacious step of openly challenging papal authority. She wrote fiery letters criticizing corruption, particularly the hypocrisy of priests who condemned nuns for sins they themselves committed. Her words spread, whispered first in cloisters, then reaching sympathetic clerics. For the Church, this was dangerous. A nun's voice was supposed to be cloistered, buried in obedience, and here she was, wielding words as weapons. Her defiance reflected the broader tension in Germany, where reform movements and mystics questioned Rome's dominance. That she dared to criticize the Pope shocked her contemporaries. Some called her inspired by God, others claimed she was possessed. Ultimately, her writings were suppressed. But her legend endured proof that within convent walls, women could be rebels clothed in veils, their pens sharper than swords. The tale of this German nun reveals how monasteries were not always docile institutions. They could become stages where women wrestled with power, conscience, and authority. Her voice, though silenced, exposed the fragility of an institution that feared what a cloistered woman could say when she dared to speak against the throne of Peter. French nunneries and the cult of pleasure. In France, especially during the late Middle Ages, convents often carried a reputation less for holiness than for indulgence. Chronicles and inquisitors' records alike speak of nunneries where aristocratic women, sent against their will, transformed cloisters into courts of pleasure. Lavish banquets, imported wines, and even masked balls crept behind convent walls. Some abbesses, descended from noble families, wielded their position like queens, entertaining influential men under the guise of pious gatherings. The cult of pleasure that arose in certain French nunneries drew scandalized commentary. One bishop, appalled at the decadence, accused a convent of operating not as a house of Christ, but as Venus' court. Stories circulated of nuns dressing in silks, wearing jewels, and singing secular love songs during feasts. These tales, while exaggerated by critics, point to the reality that convent life was not uniform. For some, the cloister became a gilded cage that its inhabitants decorated as they pleased. Such indulgence carried a cost. Reforming bishops tried to impose strict discipline, ordering the burning of luxuries and banning music beyond hymns. Yet the French nunneries' reputation endured a mixture of envy, scandal, and fascination. They became symbols of a broader truth, when wealth and power seeped into the cloister. Vows of poverty and chastity could quickly dissolve. Italian convents and Renaissance intrigues. In Renaissance Italy, where art, politics, and family alliances intertwined, convents were far from isolated. Wealthy families placed their daughters in nunneries, not only to save dowry costs, but also to extend their influence. Some convents became miniature courts where intrigue flourished. Alliances were plotted through confessional whispers, and abbesses acted as brokers of family interests. Behind their veils, these women played the game of power as deftly as any duke or cardinal. Art and beauty also flourished within these Italian cloisters. Some nuns were talented painters and poets, their work circulating under male names to avoid scandal. Others became muses for artists, secretly inspiring paintings that hinted at their hidden desires. Yet scandal was never far. Rumors abounded of convents where young noble women entertained secret lovers, smuggled in under the cover of night. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on human desire and beauty, seeped into cloistered life. Italian nunneries embodied this paradox. Outwardly sanctuaries of purity, inwardly entangled with the passions, politics, and ambitions of the age. For some, the convent was not a retreat from the world, but an alternative arena where the drama of power and desire continued in veiled form. English nuns, in the shadow of Henry VIII. In England, the fate of nunneries was sealed when Henry VIII broke with Rome. Yet before their dissolution, English convents lived under the shadow of suspicion. Reformers painted them as dens of idleness and corruption, echoing tales of lustful nuns to justify confiscation of their lands. Inspectors reported shocking discoveries: nuns who bore children, abbesses accused of embezzlement, and convents more akin to farms than houses of prayer. Whether all of these claims were true mattered less than their usefulness in propaganda. For the women inside, this period was one of terror and uncertainty. Some resisted fiercely, clinging to their vows even as their convents were seized. Others quietly accepted pensions and returned to secular life. A few tragic stories speak of nuns who, unable to face the loss of their spiritual home, took their own lives. The destruction of English nunneries was not just a political act, it was a cultural rupture, silencing centuries of female voices that had shaped England's spiritual and intellectual life. In the shadow of Henry's reforms, the image of the nun became a contested symbol. To Protestants, she was a figure of corruption and superstition. To Catholics, she was a martyr of faith. Between these narratives lay the silenced reality of women whose lives were uprooted by the king's ambition. Spanish mystics and the Inquisition. Spain produced some of the most celebrated mystical nuns. Women like Teresa of Avila, whose visions of divine ecstasy still inspire awe. Yet alongside reverence came fear. The Inquisition watched closely, suspicious of any woman whose spirituality seemed too unregulated. Visions of Christ as a lover, ecstatic writings of union with the divine, these could be celebrated as sainthood or condemned as heresy, depending on the mood of the church. Some Spanish nuns fell afoul of the Inquisition, accused of exaggerating visions or consorting with demons. Others were forced to confess under torture, their spiritual experiences reinterpreted as witchcraft. The paradox was stark. The same visions that inspired reform and devotion could also bring ruin. Still, Spain's mystics left a profound mark. Their writings, filled with passion and intimacy, challenged the boundaries between body and soul, desire and devotion. They revealed a truth the Church could never fully suppress, that within the cloister, the human heart beat fiercely, longing for connection, whether divine or earthly, and nunneries as places of refuge for prostitutes. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the line between sanctity and scandal blurred even further when certain nunneries became unexpected refuges for women of fallen reputation. In many European towns, city councils or bishops, uneasy with the presence of prostitutes, yet unwilling to lose their tax revenues, devised a peculiar compromise. Some prostitutes were forced into convents as a form of reform, while others sought the cloister voluntarily as a last refuge when their beauty faded or fortunes turned. This practice created volatile communities. On one side were devout women, trained since childhood for a life of prayer. On the other, women with lived experience of brothels, streets, and survival. Chroniclers describe tensions within these mixed convents, arguments in the refectory, accusations of improper conduct, and suspicion from outside neighbors who whispered that the convent was no better than the brothel it claimed to redeem. Reform-minded clergy worried that these nunneries offered not redemption but contamination, spiritual and moral. Yet these arrangements also reflected a brutal practicality. The medieval world had few places for outcast women, and the convent was both prison and shelter. Some prostitutes found genuine peace in cloister life. Others brought with them habits and networks that shocked the pure sisters. By the 15th century, critics seized upon these scandals as proof that nunneries had lost their way, using them as ammunition for broader reforms. Escaping the cloister, runaway nuns, the cloister was meant to be permanent, its gates locked as firmly as a tomb, yet records abound of women who chose to defy that permanence and flee. These runaway nuns appear in bishops' visitation reports, court proceedings, and scandalous pamphlets. Some escaped for love, smuggled out by admirers in daring nighttime rescues. Others fled oppressive abbesses, cruel punishments, or the crushing weight of unwanted vows imposed by families. The Church considered escape a grave sin tantamount to breaking a marriage with Christ himself. Runaway nuns were hunted, sometimes with the same zeal as criminals. Punishments varied: public humiliation, imprisonment, or forced penance. Yet the persistence of such escapes shows that cloistered life was not always freely chosen, nor easily endured. Behind the romanticized image of serene abbeys lay stories of desperation and rebellion. In some cases, runaway nuns found refuge with sympathetic communities townsfolk who despised corrupt convents, or noble patrons who valued the scandal it caused the Church. Others met tragic fates, captured and punished brutally to discourage further rebellion. Their stories reveal the tension between personal freedom and institutional control, and how women sometimes risked everything to reclaim their lives. The scandal of mixed monasteries. Few arrangements scandalized the medieval imagination more than double monasteries' houses, where men and women lived within the same enclosure, albeit in separate quarters, though some were founded with good intentions, emphasizing shared prayer and spiritual equality. Critics swiftly painted them as tinderboxes of temptation. Gossip accused monks and nuns of secret meetings, hidden tunnels, and whispered trysts during vigils. Church councils repeatedly attempted to abolish or regulate such institutions. The potential for sexual scandal loomed large, regardless of whether it was reality or rumor. Bishops argued that mixed monasteries gave enemies of the Church endless ammunition, and indeed, satirical poets gleefully mocked these communities, painting lurid images of cloisters where vows of chastity crumbled as soon as the candles dimmed. Yet it would be simplistic to dismiss these double monasteries as pure corruption. Some thrived as centers of learning where men and women exchanged ideas in ways otherwise forbidden. They embodied, briefly, a radical vision of cooperation. But in an age obsessed with female purity, the mere idea of men and women under one roof was too scandalous to last. Their decline was less about actual misconduct than about the fear of what might occur behind their walls. Popular ballads, mocking nuns and monks. The cloister's reputation was not shaped only by chronicles and papal decrees, but also by the voices of the common people. Across medieval Europe, ballads and songs circulated, mocking monks and nuns for their supposed hypocrisy. These verses, often sung in taverns or marketplaces, painted the cloister as a place of secret lovers, drunken feasts, and broken vows. A typical ballad might tell of a nun meeting her lover under the moonlight, or an abbess caught with a baby hidden beneath her robes. Such songs were part entertainment, part social critique. For villagers who often supported convents with tithes and labor, mocking ballads provided a safe outlet to express suspicion toward the wealthy and powerful Church. Humor, laced with scandal, became resistance. The Church condemned these songs as blasphemy, yet their popularity showed how deeply skepticism of monastic purity ran among the laity. Though exaggerated, these ballads reinforced the image of the naughty nun, embedding it into cultural memory. They also reveal how scandal functioned not only as history, but as story a weapon wielded by ordinary people, against institutions that claimed holiness while often living otherwise. The end of medieval nunneries and the Reformation, the 16th century, brought a cataclysm. With the Reformation, entire networks of nunneries were dissolved across Protestant lands. Reformers like Martin Luther condemned convents as prisons, accusing them of fostering vice and idleness. In England, Henry VIII seized their wealth, turning abbeys into royal property. Overnight, thousands of nuns were cast into uncertainty. Some married. Others sought service. Many simply vanished into poverty. For Catholic Europe, the Counter-Reformation redefined cloistered life. New orders emphasized stricter enclosure, reinforced discipline, and insisted on greater control over female religious. Gone were the days of laxity, of nunneries hosting feasts or harboring scandalous secrets. The age of experiment and intrigue within convent walls was ending, replaced by a renewed image of austere piety. Yet the memory of medieval scandals endured. Reformers eagerly repeated tales of lustful nuns and corrupt abbesses to justify their actions. Even as real convents disappeared, the idea of the scandalous nun thrived in sermons, pamphlets, and literature. The Reformation was both an end and a beginning, the death of medieval nunneries, and the birth of a new, lasting myth of what they had been. The legend of the wayward abbess. In the chronicles of medieval rumor, few tales stirred both fascination and fear as much as those of the wayward abbess. This was a stock character. In both folklore and moral sermons, the supposedly holy woman who secretly abandoned her vows, leading her convent into scandal. Sometimes these legends depicted abbesses seducing priests. Other times they painted her as an outright tyrant, enriching herself at the expense of the poor. What mattered most was not whether these stories were true, but how they served as warnings to the faithful reminders that even cloistered women, revered as brides of Christ, could fall prey to sin. The abbess in these tales symbolized both dangerous female autonomy and the fragility of religious discipline. The story often began with the abbess breaking a single vow, accepting gifts, harboring too much comfort, or taking in a lover. From there, the legend spiraled, with the convent becoming a place of excess and sin. Popular accounts exaggerated these falls into shocking proportions, claiming some Abbesses turned their convents into feasting halls, drinking wine and laughing away the hours in bed. Church preachers seized upon such legends to warn against women in power, using them to argue that strict male oversight was necessary to keep convents in check. These stories also reveal the way medieval society projected its anxieties about women, wealth, and sexuality. An abbess who wielded land and influence threatened male authority, and so the tales turned her into a caricature, stripping her of holiness and making her an object of scandal. In folklore, she was rarely punished by the church alone. Divine wrath struck her down. Some legends ended with wayward abbesses struck by lightning, collapsing during Mass, or even being swallowed into the earth. These apocalyptic fates reinforced the idea that God himself disapproved of such corruption. Yet in their wild exaggerations, these legends also hint at a reality the church could not erase. Women in convents did wield power, sometimes beyond what was considered proper. Whether or not the abbess was as sinful as legend claimed, her mere ability to stand outside traditional family roles made her a target. Thus, the wayward abbess survives in literature as both a demonized figure and a symbol of female resistance, one whose very scandal carried echoes of suppressed truths about cloistered life. Chaucer's prioress and satirical portrayals. When Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, he offered readers one of the most enduring satirical portraits of a nun, the prioress. Far from being a figure of unshakable piety, Chaucer's nun is painted as vain, delicate, and overly concerned with manners. She speaks French poorly, feeds her dogs rich food while ignoring the poor, and wears a rosary with a love token that reads Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. For readers of the time, the joke was obvious. This prioress cared more for courtly love and social status than for spiritual devotion. Satire such as Chaucer's worked to expose hypocrisy in the church, but it also entertained audiences with its playful subversion of sacred ideals. To laugh at a nun was to laugh at the contradictions of a society that placed women into cloisters, yet could never fully erase their humanity. Chaucer, with his sharp wit, suggested that under the veil might lurk the same vanities and desires as any noblewoman. The prioress was not scandalous in the sense of overt sin, but in her subtle betrayals of what was expected of a religious woman. This literary device of poking fun at nuns spread far beyond Chaucer. Throughout Europe, jesters, poets, and balladeers filled taverns and courts with verses, mocking the foibles of convent life. Some claim that nuns loved fashion as much as prayer, or that they maintained secret romances despite their vows. These works were dangerous not because they accused all nuns of scandal, but because they made such accusations appear humorous and therefore acceptable for public consumption. In truth, satire was one of the most powerful tools against the Church. While theological debates or papal bulls might not reach common people, a funny poem about a greedy abbess or a flirtatious nun certainly would. Chaucer's Prioress thus belongs not only to the world of literature but to the broader culture of suspicion surrounding female monasticism. In her delicate manners and misplaced affections, she embodies the tension between the sacred and the worldly attention that audiences found both laughable and irresistible. Erotic tales of nuns in medieval literature. Beyond satire lay something even more provocative: outright erotic tales featuring nuns. Medieval Europe, far from being a prudish society, produced a surprising body of literature that reveled in the scandalous idea of cloistered women breaking their vows. These stories often circulated in manuscripts hidden among secular collections or whispered orally in taverns. They fed on fantasies of the forbidden, painting the cloister as a place where repression inevitably gave way to indulgence. One of the most famous collections to toy with such themes was Boccaccio's Decameron. While not exclusively about nuns, it included tales of lustful clerics and clever women who turned religious rules into opportunities for seduction. Other stories from France and Italy featured monks sneaking into convents disguised as priests or confessors, sometimes bedding entire groups of nuns. To medieval audiences, these tales were not only titillating, they were also acts of rebellion against the moral authority of the Church. By laughing at the idea of a nun as a lover, people found a safe way to critique the very institution that claimed to police their desires. The persistence of these erotic stories reveals a cultural truth. Nunneries fascinated the imagination precisely because they combined extremes. On the one hand, they symbolized purity, virginity, and separation from the world. On the other, they embodied the mystery of women hidden from public life. The veil that concealed their faces became, in fantasy, an invitation to imagine what lay beneath. The erotic nun became both an object of desire and a critique of religious hypocrisy. Though the Church condemned such tales as slander, they never fully disappeared. On the contrary, they spread across Europe, later inspiring Renaissance art and early modern literature. Even today, echoes of these medieval fantasies linger in the trope of the naughty nun, a cultural figure whose roots stretch deep into the scandalous storytelling of the Middle Ages. The image of the naughty nun in art. Art, too, took up the theme of scandalous nuns, though often in more coded forms. Medieval manuscripts sometimes included marginal illustrations of nuns behaving mischievously, dancing, drinking, or even in compromising positions with monks. While these images could be interpreted as satire, their very presence in devotional books hints at the fascination that cloistered women held even for those who professed faith. It was as if artists, while illuminating sacred texts, could not resist sneaking in a playful jab at the supposed holiness of the cloister. By the Renaissance, this imagery grew bolder. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch painted chaotic scenes of religious figures engaged in sinful behavior, including nuns indulging in feasts or sexual excess. Such works were both moral warnings and sensational entertainment. They suggested to viewers that no one was immune to corruption, not even the veiled women who lived behind convent walls. In popular woodcuts and engravings, especially during the Reformation, the figure of the naughty nun became a political weapon. Protestant artists produced scathing images of nuns and monks engaging in orgies, using them to condemn the Catholic Church as inherently corrupt. These depictions were deliberately exaggerated, but they cemented the image of the nun as a figure of scandal in the public imagination. What makes these artworks striking is how they walked the line between the sacred and the profane. On one level, they shocked viewers with their indecency. On another, they reinforced the authority of reformers by presenting convents as places of hidden vice. The artistic trope of the naughty nun thus reveals not only medieval curiosity, but also the power of visual culture to shape how society remembered its religious women, not as silent saints, but as scandalous figures of desire and ridicule. Popular myths and exaggerations. Finally, we must turn to the myths that grew larger than life. Over centuries, stories of scandalous nuns were embroidered, exaggerated, and repeated until they bore little resemblance to reality. Tales of pregnant nuns, hidden brothels disguised as convents, and secret tunnels connecting monasteries to nunneries became staples of gossip. Some even claimed that entire convents had been wiped out by divine fire, for their sins a dramatic flourish, designed to both terrify and titillate. These myths thrive because they fulfilled deep societal needs. They provided cautionary tales about the dangers of repression, entertained audiences hungry for scandal, and justified reforms imposed upon female religious houses. At the same time, they offered a strange kind of liberation by imagining nuns as transgressive. Society allowed itself to explore taboos it could not openly discuss. In that sense, the myth of the scandalous nun was less about real women and more about the fantasies of those outside the cloister. Yet within these exaggerations, some truths flickered. Sexual misconduct did occur. Wealth and corruption did seep into certain convents, and women did occasionally rebel against their vows. The myth magnified these incidents to monstrous proportions, turning individual scandals into symbols of systemic corruption. Whether one believed them or not, the tales stuck, shaping how generations viewed the cloistered life. Even today, popular culture continues to recycle these myths. From novels to films that portray nuns as secret lovers, witches, or rebels. The persistence of these exaggerations reveals just how deeply the image of the scandalous nun has embedded itself in Western imagination. What began as whispers in taverns and marginal doodles in manuscripts has grown into a cultural archetype, reminder of how the cloister, far from being forgotten, still haunts the collective memory with its secrets, scandals, and seductive mysteries. The hidden voices of medieval nuns in letters, while public narratives often focused on scandal. The most intimate glimpses into convent life come from the letters and personal writings of the nuns themselves. Hidden away in archives and monasteries, these manuscripts reveal the thoughts, fears, and desires of women whose voices were otherwise muted. Many letters were devotional, expressing a nun's love for Christ and dedication to prayer. But beneath the pious surface, hints of personal struggle often emerge. Loneliness, sexual tension, and frustration with strict rules. Some nuns wrote directly to abbesses or patrons, pleading for relief from harsh treatment, seeking permission for study, or subtly questioning the rigidity of convent life. These letters expose the tension between individual humanity and institutional expectations. For example, one 14th-century nun described her internal battle with temptations of the flesh, balancing shame and devotion in the same paragraph. The candid nature of these writings makes them invaluable for historians attempting to reconstruct the daily realities of cloistered women. Other correspondence reveals a sophisticated awareness of social and political dynamics. Nuns often discussed land disputes, inheritance issues, and interactions with local authorities. Through these letters, convents were not isolated. They were deeply enmeshed in broader networks of power and influence. These writings also document friendships and rivalries, illustrating that convent life was socially rich and emotionally complex, despite the veils and vows. The survival of such manuscripts is remarkable, given the Church's tendency to suppress material it deemed improper. In some cases, letters were carefully hidden, copied in private script, or disguised as devotional notes. Their existence reminds us that nuns were not merely passive recipients of church rules. They actively recorded their lives, asserting agency in small but significant ways. Ultimately, these letters serve as a counter-narrative to the scandalous depictions propagated in literature and folklore. They show that behind the myths and eroticized fantasies lay real women navigating faith, power, and desire. With intelligence and resilience, in reading them, modern audiences can hear voices that were silenced for centuries, providing nuance and humanity to the image of the medieval nun. Rediscovering lost manuscripts of the convent. Across Europe, countless convent libraries held treasures that have only recently come to light. Hidden manuscripts, once thought lost, reveal a striking diversity of thought and knowledge among medieval nuns. Beyond devotional texts, these works included medical treatises, botanical guides, poetry, and even early experiments in philosophy and astronomy. The rediscovery of such manuscripts challenges assumptions that convents were intellectually barren. Many of these documents reveal nuns as custodians of culture and knowledge. copied texts with remarkable precision, translating Latin works into vernacular languages, preserving classical wisdom, and even contributing original commentary. Some manuscripts hint at clandestine exchanges of ideas, where nuns shared subversive thoughts or radical theological questions that could not be spoken aloud in public. The survival and study of these manuscripts also illuminate the ways convents served as intellectual havens for women excluded from universities and public scholarship. For instance, some 15th century nunneries maintained extensive libraries where sisters debated scripture, composed poetry, and documented local history. The rediscovery of these works has forced modern historians to reevaluate the educational role of female monasticism. Furthermore, these manuscripts reveal tensions between obedience and curiosity. Marginal notes often contain critical observations or personal reflections, suggesting that nuns engaged with texts not merely as passive readers, but as active interpreters. Such insights show that convents were spaces where female intellect could flourish, even under the constraints of cloistered life. These rediscovered texts also allow us to contextualize the scandalous stories that circulated outside convent walls. While folklore emphasized erotic transgressions or rebellious abbesses, the manuscripts demonstrate a rich, disciplined intellectual culture. They remind us that the reality of convent life was far more nuanced than the exaggerated scandals suggest, blending devotion, creativity, and subtle resistance in ways that have only recently been appreciated. Scandals as tools of church reform. Scandal, whether real or imagined, was often harnessed as a mechanism of reform. Church authorities frequently invoke tales of lustful nuns or corrupt abbesses to justify interventions in convents, tighten oversight, and enforce stricter rules. The exposure of scandalous behavior served as both a warning and a political tool, legitimizing hierarchical control over female religious houses. Papal inquiries into nunneries often began with accusations of impropriety, sometimes exaggerated or fabricated. While some incidents involved genuine misconduct, others were amplified to enforce discipline. Reports of pregnant nuns, hidden lovers, or luxurious convent lifestyles were circulated widely, ensuring that both nuns and lay people internalized the church's moral expectations. Scandal, in this sense, became performative, reinforcing power structures under the guise of moral vigilance. At the same time, reformers occasionally used scandal to address broader societal concerns. Claims of corruption or greed could prompt investigations into mismanaged lands, financial irregularities, or lax educational standards. By framing administrative shortcomings as moral failings, the Church could justify sweeping reforms that affected not only individual nuns, but the structure of monastic life itself. Interestingly, the role of scandal in reform reveals a duality. While it punished nuns and imposed obedience, it also highlighted their influence. If their behavior or the perception of their behavior could provoke papal action, nuns held latent power, capable of shaking institutions from within. Even in tales of punishment, we glimpse the social and political significance of cloistered women. Ultimately, scandals acted as both carrot and stick. They provided moral lessons to the faithful, reinforced male oversight, and offered nuns opportunities to negotiate compliance and resistance. In this way, scandal was not merely destructive, it was deeply intertwined with the evolution of monastic regulation and church authority in medieval Europe. The transformation of nuns in modern imagination. The legacy of medieval nuns continues to evolve in contemporary culture. From novels to films and television series, nuns are often portrayed as either paragons of virtue or objects of erotic fantasy. These modern representations owe much to the legends, satire, and scandals of the past, blending history with myth to create compelling narratives that resonate with audiences today. Modern scholarship, however, seeks to disentangle reality from myth. By examining manuscripts, letters, and convent archives, historians are uncovering the nuanced lives of nuns women who balance devotion, intellect, and occasionally rebellion. These studies challenge the persistent stereotype of the cloister as either entirely holy or entirely corrupt, revealing complex social networks, intellectual engagement, and psychological depth. Popular culture continues to grapple with this duality. Nuns are depicted as mystical figures capable of divine insight, agents of rebellion against patriarchal structures, or even subversive sexual beings. These portrayals, though fictionalized, underscore the enduring fascination with female monasticism and its intersection with secrecy, power, and desire. The transformation of nuns in the modern imagination also reflects broader societal questions. How do we interpret female agency under constraint? How do myths shape cultural memory? By exploring these questions, we can better understand both the historical realities of convent life and the symbolic power that nuns continue to hold in contemporary thought. Medieval nuns exposed. What their secrets reveal about society. Finally, looking across centuries, the stories of scandalous, intelligent, and rebellious nuns offer a window into medieval society itself. Nuns were both products of and participants in a world defined by rigid hierarchies, gendered expectations, and intense religious devotion. Their secrets, desires, and struggles illuminate broader tensions between institutional authority and personal autonomy. Scandals reveal anxieties about women's sexuality, power, and intellectual capacity. They highlight the ways in which society policed female behavior, particularly in spaces that offered unusual independence. At the same time, the hidden lives of nuns preserved in letters, manuscripts, and oral traditions demonstrate resilience, creativity, and agency, showing that even in cloistered life, women shaped their own destinies. Through the lens of scandal, the world of the medieval convent becomes vividly human. It is a place where devotion and desire coexist, where power and vulnerability intersect, and where myth and reality intertwine. The fascination with nuns' secrets continues to reflect enduring questions about morality, autonomy, and social control. In the end, Medieval Nuns Exposed is not merely about scandal lit. It's about understanding the complex interplay between religion, gender, and society. The cloister, once a hidden world, now speaks across centuries, offering lessons about human nature, institutional power, and the enduring tension between rules and rebellion. As we step back from the shadowed cloisters and hidden corridors of medieval convents, one thing becomes clear. The lives of nuns were far more complex, human, and fascinating than history books have often suggested. Behind the veil of devotion lay desires, intellect, rebellion, and sometimes scandal reminders that even the most cloistered lives were filled with stories of courage, secrecy, and resilience. These women navigated a world of strict rules, religious devotion, and social expectation, yet they left traces of their true selves for us to uncover centuries later. The secrets, letters, and manuscripts we've explored today reveal not just the nuns' struggles, but the society around them, the world grappling with power, gender, morality, and faith. From forbidden romances to mystical visions, from intellectual pursuits to scandalous trials. These stories offer a rare glimpse into the tension between human nature and institutional authority. If you found yourself fascinated, shocked, or intrigued by the secrets of these medieval convents, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more curious minds discover the hidden corners of history. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the bizarre, the scandalous, and the untold stories of our past. And if you want to explore more secrets hidden in history's shadows, check out our other videos. Every one of them is packed with tales that textbooks won't dare tell. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Which nun's story shocked you the most? Or which scandal would you have loved to witness firsthand?